On a warm summer night in a quiet coastal town, 18-year-old boy Conrad Roy sat alone in the driver's seat of his pickup truck, parked beneath a line of dark trees where no one would pass until morning, and he stared at his phone with the same trembling uncertainty that had followed him for months. He had sealed the windows with towels, just like he'd been told, and the low hum of the generator in the truck bed filled the air with a dull mechanical rhythm that sounded almost like breathing. And for a moment, he wondered whether anyone would notice if that breathing stopped. Conrad had always been the dependable one, the son who helped his mother carry groceries without being asked, the boy who texted his little sister before every game to tell her he loved her, the friend who listened more than he spoke. And yet none of that steadiness could quiet the storm that had taken hold of him during the previous year, a heaviness that turned ordinary days into something he had to push through rather than live inside. Tonight was supposed to end that struggle, or at least that was what he had been telling himself during the long drive out to the empty lot, repeating words that did not even feel like his own anymore. He turned the key that started the generator, and the engine coughed awake behind him, sending exhaust slowly into the sealed cab. And within seconds Conrad felt the first wave of panic rise through his chest, the primitive instinct that demands air and escape in life. His hands began to shake. He reached for the door handle. He opened it. Night air rushed in like relief itself, and Conrad stumbled out onto the gravel, coughing, dizzy, frightened by how quickly his resolve had fractured. He leaned against the truck, staring at the ground, and for a brief, fragile moment, survival felt possible again. Then his phone vibrated in his hand. A new message lit the screen from the one person he believed understood the darkness inside him better than anyone else on earth. The one voice he trusted when his own thoughts became unbearable. He opened it, breath unsteady, eyes searching for comfort. Instead, he read 4 words that would follow him into history: "Get back in." Conrad hesitated, caught between instinct and influence, between the body's plea to live and the promise he believed he had already made. He typed back that he was scared. The reply came quickly, urgent, insistent, reminding him why he had started, telling him he had to finish, telling him everyone would understand, telling him this was the only way the pain would end. The authority in those messages carried the weight of certainty Conrad no longer possessed himself, and in that fragile state, certainty can feel like rescue even when it leads toward destruction. He climbed back into the truck. He closed the door. He stayed. Within minutes, the oxygen thinned, his movements slowed, and the boy who had once carried groceries and texted his sister goodnight slipped quietly into unconsciousness, alone except for the phone resting beside him, still glowing with words that would soon become evidence. When morning came and Conrad Roy did not answer calls, the discovery of his truck brought shock and grief to a family that had never imagined the struggle he kept hidden so carefully. At first, it appeared to be another heartbreaking teenage suicide, the kind that leaves parents searching endlessly for signs they missed. But investigators soon learned that Conrad had not been alone in his final hours, at least not in the way that mattered most in a world where connection travels through screens. Thousands of messages surfaced between Conrad and a teenage girl from another town, someone he had met during a brief summer vacation and stayed close to through months of constant texting, someone who had slowly become the center of his emotional world. She had not been present in the truck. She had not touched the generator. Yet within those conversations were instructions, encouragements, reassurances, and finally that final directive that sent Conrad back into the sealed cab. Prosecutors would later argue that her influence crossed a line no court had ever confronted before, that in guiding him past hesitation, she had transformed private despair into an act shaped by another person's will. The case that followed forced investigators, lawyers, and an entire nation to confront a question as unsettling as the tragedy itself. If someone already fragile is urged toward death by the person they trust most, where does responsibility begin and where does it end? Conrad Roy's story is not simply about a boy who died in a truck on a summer night. It is about the unseen power of words exchanged in isolation, about how digital intimacy can deepen dependence, and about how persuasion can take hold when someone stands at the edge of their own endurance. The girl who sent that final message would insist she never meant to kill, that she believed he would not truly follow through, that she was trying to help him find peace. Yet the record of their conversations revealed something far more complex, a progression from sympathy to reinforcement, from listening to directing, until the boundary between support and control blurred beyond recognition. As the timeline unfolded, what investigators uncovered inside those messages would shock the country and reshape how the law understands influence in the age of constant connection, because this was not only the story of Conrad Roy last night, but of how a relationship carried almost entirely through text could end with irreversible consequence. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. They were two teenagers who lived less than an hour apart in the same stretch of coastal Massachusetts. Yet their connection existed almost entirely through the glow of their phones. Thousands upon thousands of messages sent across quiet bedrooms and empty afternoons, building a relationship that felt deeper to them than distance would suggest. Conrad Henry Roy III was the kind of boy people described as gentle, someone who worried about disappointing others more than he worried about himself, someone who carried sadness carefully so it would not burden the people he loved. And in the year before his death, that sadness had hardened into something heavier, something clinical and persistent that followed him through hospital stays and counseling sessions and long nights where sleep would not come. Michelle Carter, by contrast, lived inside a constant hunger to be noticed, to be needed, to occupy a role in someone else's life that felt irreplaceable. And when she and Conrad began talking after meeting briefly on a family trip, she discovered in him a vulnerability that gave her attention a sense of importance she had rarely felt before. Their conversations began the way many teenage connections do, with confessions about loneliness, about feeling misunderstood, about wanting someone who would listen without judgment. And for Conrad, the relief of being heard by someone outside his immediate world was powerful, while for Michelle, the opportunity to be the one person he leaned on became central to her identity. Over months, the messages grew longer, more intimate, more consuming, until Conrad's despair and Michelle's need for significance intertwined in ways neither fully recognized, and what might have remained private struggles instead formed a closed circuit of reassurance, reinforcement, and emotional dependency. Conrad spoke often about wanting his pain to stop, about feeling exhausted by the effort of continuing, and Michelle responded with sympathy at first, telling him she cared, telling him she understood, but gradually her tone shifted towards something more directive, encouraging him to see death not as an escape he feared, but as a step he could take. To outsiders, the relationship seemed distant and occasional. Two teenagers who rarely met in person and whose lives moved along separate tracks in neighboring towns. But inside their message history, a different reality had taken shape, one where Michelle's words carried weight far beyond what physical presence would suggest. Conrad's vulnerability deepened as months passed, his confidence in recovery fading, his reliance on Michelle's responses increasing, and she, in turn, became more assertive in shaping the narrative he described about himself, framing his suffering as permanent and his death as meaningful, as something that would bring relief and even recognition. It is within that progression that the central questions of this story take hold, questions that would later confront courts and commentators alike. Did Michelle Carter push Conrad Henry Roy III toward death, or did she merely echo desires he already carried? Did Conrad ultimately act on his own will, or did repeated persuasion alter the course of his final decision? And in a world where influence can travel through words alone, where does responsibility end and where does another person's power begin? Because the most unsettling aspect of this tragedy is not only the message that reached Conrad in his final moments, but what Michelle Carter did afterward, how she spoke about his death, how she positioned herself within the story that followed, and how investigators, piecing together timelines and transcripts, began to see that the relationship preserved in those thousands of messages revealed something far more consequential than anyone had first understood. Conrad Henry Roy III grew up in the kind of Massachusetts coastal community where families often knew each other across generations, where Little League schedules and school events formed the rhythm of local life, and where Conrad was known as a polite, soft-spoken boy who rarely caused concern. He was close to his family in the quiet, dependable ways that do not always draw attention, helping his father with errands, spending evenings with his grandparents, and maintaining the steady courtesy adults often remember when they try to make sense of loss. Those who knew him described a sensitivity that could be mistaken for shyness, a tendency to internalize worry rather than express it. And as adolescence brought the usual pressures of identity and expectation, Conrad's inner life grew more fragile than anyone realized at first. He struggled with anxiety that sharpened into depression, the kind that drains energy and confidence slowly, leaving a person feeling detached from the future they once assumed would unfold naturally. By his mid-teens, Conrad had entered treatment programs and counseling, periods his family hoped would restore stability, and at times he appeared to improve, speaking of plans, returning to routines, offering reassurances that he was managing. Yet depression often moves in cycles rather than straight lines, and Conrad's sense of isolation deepened between those brighter intervals, particularly when he felt he could not explain his thoughts without worrying the people he loved. Friends noticed he could withdraw for stretches, answering messages less often, seeming preoccupied even when present. And while he never lost the kindness that defined him, he increasingly carried a private exhaustion that made ordinary challenges feel insurmountable. What Conrad wanted most was connection that felt safe and complete, someone who would understand without needing explanation, someone outside the circle of family expectations where he could speak freely about the heaviness he carried. And then, during a brief summer encounter that seemed inconsequential at the time, Conrad Henry Roy III met someone who finally appeared to offer exactly that understanding. Michelle Carter's world looked different on the surface, yet revolved around a similar longing to be seen. She grew up in another Massachusetts town with its own routines and school hierarchies, and those who encountered her casually often described an awkward earnestness, a girl who tried hard to fit social expectations but often felt slightly out of place. Michelle's insecurity expressed itself less through withdrawal than through performance, a constant effort to shape how others perceived her, to occupy roles that would earn sympathy, admiration, or emotional closeness. In an era when identity could be curated through posts and messages, she learned to present herself online with greater confidence than she felt in person, crafting narratives of struggle and resilience that drew attention and concern from peers. This pattern did not arise from cruelty so much as from a deep need for validation. Yet over time the boundary between genuine feeling and constructed persona blurred, and Michelle increasingly measured her worth by the intensity of reactions she could evoke. Within that framework, tragedy held a peculiar appeal, not as harm inflicted, but as a stage upon which devotion and loyalty could be displayed. Michelle followed stories of loss and recovery closely, imagining how it might feel to be central in such narratives, to be recognized as the person who cared most, who endured most, who remained after others were gone. When she began communicating with Conrad, she encountered someone whose vulnerability made that imagined role possible in real time, someone whose pain invited response, and whose dependence could confirm her importance. Their exchanges allowed Michelle to inhabit a position she had rehearsed internally, the indispensable confidant, the one who understood suffering intimately and offered guidance through it. Long before any irreversible act occurred, she had already pictured herself as the grieving girlfriend at the center of a tragedy, the figure others would look to with sympathy and awe, and those imaginings would shape how she responded as Conrad's despair intensified. Their relationship, unlike most teenage romances rooted in shared spaces and experiences, would unfold almost entirely through screens and signals, words carrying emotional force across distance, while both remained physically separate in their own small Massachusetts towns. What began between Conrad Henry Roy III and Michelle Carter as occasional check-ins soon expanded into a constant thread of communication that filled nearly every quiet moment of their days. Messages sent before school, between classes, late into the night, and often continuing past midnight, as each searched the other's replies for reassurance that they were understood. For Conrad, whose depression often left him feeling isolated even when surrounded by family, Michelle's steady presence through text created a sense of closeness he struggled to achieve elsewhere, and he began to share thoughts he had never voiced aloud, describing his fears, his exhaustion, and the recurring sense that he was disappointing everyone despite his efforts. Michelle responded with affirmation that seemed unconditional, telling him she saw his pain clearly, that he mattered deeply to her, that she alone grasped how much he was enduring, And over time, Conrad's reliance on that validation grew stronger, until her words carried the authority of someone who knew him more intimately than anyone else. Their exchanges developed a rhythm of mutual loneliness, each presenting themselves as uniquely attuned to the other's suffering, reinforcing the belief that their bond existed beyond ordinary friendship or teenage romance. Conrad would tell Michelle she was the only one who truly listened, the only one who did not judge, and Michelle echoed that sentiment, framing their connection as rare and irreplaceable. Yet within this intimacy, the focus of their conversations gradually shifted, and the comfort Michelle initially offered in response to Conrad's despair began to include language that framed death as release rather than tragedy, suggesting peace instead of loss. Conrad's references to wanting escape, once met with sympathy and encouragement to seek help, were increasingly answered with statements that normalized his wish to disappear, and the distinction between understanding his pain and endorsing his self-destructive thoughts grew less clear. The transition was subtle enough that neither seemed to mark it consciously, but its direction was unmistakable. What had been a space of consolation was becoming a place where suicide was discussed not as something to prevent, but as something to consider. And then the conversations took a turn no one around them could have imagined. Michelle Carter began to speak of Conrad's death in terms that transformed it into a narrative of liberation, telling him he would be free from suffering, that the struggle consuming him would finally end, and that people would at last recognize how much he had endured. These messages reframed his despair as evidence that life itself was the problem rather than the illness afflicting him, and Conrad, already weakened by depression's distortions, absorbed that framing with increasing seriousness. Their texts moved from abstract references to death toward concrete discussions of how and when it might occur, with Michelle raising the idea that action would resolve the limbo Conrad felt trapped within. She spoke about the impact his death might have, suggesting it would validate the depth of his pain and bring attention to what he had survived, and she positioned herself as the witness who understood that significance. The dynamic created a psychological tension difficult to parse even in retrospect. Michelle's words could be read as empathy pushed to extremes, or as influence shaping a vulnerable mind toward irreversible action. By the early months of 2014, the exchange of messages had crossed into territory where planning replaced speculation, and by summer 2014, they were discussing methods with disturbing specificity. In the weeks leading to August, the tone of their communication grew more urgent, marked by countdown language and renewed pressure each time Conrad expressed hesitation. He told Michelle he was unsure, that he did not know if he could go through with it. That part of him still wanted relief without death, and these moments revealed how fragile his resolve remained. Michelle answered with insistence that he had already decided, that he needed to stop delaying, that returning to ordinary life would only prolong his suffering. She reminded him of previous conversations, reinforcing the expectation that he would follow through, and Conrad's responses reflected a struggle between fear and obligation, as though he had committed not only to an act, but to a shared narrative he no longer felt able to withdraw from. The dependency that had once provided comfort now bound him to her approval, and the prospect of disappointing the one person he believed understood him became another source of pressure. By early August 2014, their texts reflected finality rather than debate, and on the night he chose, Conrad Henry Roy III drove to a secluded parking area carrying the generator he had obtained, his phone still within reach, and Michelle Carter still present in the only way she had ever been, through the words on his screen. On the night of August 12, 2014, Conrad Henry Roy III followed through on the plan that had taken shape across months of messages, driving his pickup truck to an isolated parking area in Fairhaven, Massachusetts, carrying with him the portable generator he had discussed with Michelle Carter in the days before. He positioned the generator in the truck bed, fed the exhaust into the sealed cab, and sat in the driver's seat with his phone close at hand, the same device that had become the center of his emotional world. When he started the generator, the enclosed space began to fill with carbon monoxide, and almost immediately his body reacted with alarm, the physical instinct to survive overwhelming the fragile determination he had tried to maintain. Panic rose fast, breathing grew strained, and Conrad opened the door and stepped out into the night air, coughing and disoriented, shaken by how quickly fear had overtaken him. In that moment outside the truck, Conrad reached for the person whose voice had guided him through every prior step, calling Michelle Carter to tell her what had happened. He said he was scared. He said he could not do it. He said he had gotten out. The hesitation he had expressed for weeks now surfaced fully, and for a brief span he stood between life and death with the possibility of turning back still open. Michelle answered him not with relief, but with insistence, reminding him of the plan, telling him he had to finish what he started, and when Conrad described stepping away from the generator, she responded with the words that would later define the case. She told him to get back in. Conrad returned to the driver's seat. He closed the door. He remained inside as the carbon monoxide accumulated, losing consciousness in the confined space while his phone lay beside him. The call ended, the decision sealed. By morning, Conrad Henry Roy III was dead in the truck, the scene initially appearing to confirm what his family feared most, that depression had claimed him despite their efforts to help. Yet the involvement of Michelle Carter during his final moments transformed the meaning of what had occurred, and as investigators began reconstructing the timeline through phone records and message histories, the details of that call and the months preceding it reframed the event from solitary suicide to something far more complex. What had unfolded inside that parked vehicle was no longer only the private act of a suffering teenager, but an interaction shaped by another person's direction at the point of greatest vulnerability. But what happened after his death would shift the tragedy even further, turning grief into scrutiny and ultimately into a criminal case that would challenge how the law understands responsibility carried through words alone. The death of Conrad Henry Roy III reverberated through the small Massachusetts communities where he had grown up, the kind of towns where tragedy travels quickly and settles heavily, especially when it involves someone so young. News spread first among family and friends, then through schools and neighborhoods, and the initial understanding was heartbreakingly familiar. A teenager lost to depression despite the support around him. Classmates spoke of his kindness, relatives described his gentle nature, and adults expressed the aching question that follows every youth suicide, wondering what signs might have been missed or what more could have been done. Sympathy extended naturally toward Michelle Carter as well, because in the days immediately after Conrad's death, she presented herself publicly as his grieving girlfriend, someone devastated by the loss of the boy she loved. On social media, she posted tributes, shared memories, and adopted the language of mourning that placed her at the center of Conrad's story. And to many observers, she appeared to embody the role of the bereaved partner, her sorrow visible and immediate. She spoke about how much Conrad had meant to her, how deeply his death had affected her, and in that portrayal she reinforced the perception that she too was a victim of the same tragedy. As investigators began their routine examination of Conrad's phone and digital records, however, the narrative that had formed publicly started to shift. What they encountered inside his message history with Michelle Carter was not merely the exchange of affection or grief expected between teenagers in love, but months of conversations that revealed sustained pressure and detailed discussion about suicide. Messages appeared in which Michelle urged Conrad to follow through when he hesitated, telling him he just had to do it, assuring him that his death would end his suffering, and even suggesting that people around him would be better off once his pain was over. The tone of these communications moved beyond passive understanding into active reinforcement, and investigators reading through them confronted a pattern that suggested influence rather than simple sympathy. The discovery stunned those reviewing the case, because the chronology showed that Michelle's involvement did not end with emotional support, but extended into repeated encouragement toward the act that ultimately killed him. Yet even within that alarming record, one set of messages stood out as more disturbing than the rest, because they were not directed to Conrad at all. In texts sent to a friend after Conrad Henry Roy III's death, Michelle Carter described her role with a candor absent from her public mourning. She wrote that Conrad had gotten out of the truck during the attempt, that he had been frightened and uncertain, and that she had told him to get back in. In those words, she acknowledged awareness of the exact moment he might have survived and confirmed that she had directed him back toward the environment that caused his death. This admission altered the interpretation of everything investigators had already seen, shifting the case from the realm of suicide influenced by conversation into the possibility that Michelle's actions constituted a form of criminal responsibility. The tragedy was no longer defined solely by Conrad's depression or his private decision, but by the documented intervention of another person at the point of reversal. As authorities assessed these messages alongside the months of encouragement preceding them, the death of Conrad Henry Roy III began to be examined not only as a personal loss, but as an event potentially shaped by coercion carried through words, and the case that followed would challenge whether such influence could rise to the level of homicide under the law. As the investigation into the death of Conrad Henry Roy III moved toward prosecution, the case entered legal territory rarely confronted in American courts, because Michelle Carter had never been physically present at the scene, had not supplied a weapon, and had not forced Conrad into the truck where he died. The entire allegation rested on communication, on messages, and a phone call that prosecutors argued altered the course of his final decision at the moment he might have survived. The central question that emerged was stark in its simplicity, yet profound in implication. Can words alone cause death? For decades, criminal law had treated suicide as an individual act unless another person directly assisted in the mechanics of it. But here the assistance alleged was psychological rather than physical, consisting of persuasion, reinforcement, and instruction delivered through a screen and a voice. As the case advanced toward trial, legal observers across the country recognized that its outcome could redefine responsibility in the digital age, where influence can reach into private moments from miles away. In court, the prosecution constructed a narrative of coercion rooted in vulnerability, presenting Conrad Henry Roy III as a teenager struggling with depression who repeatedly expressed doubt about dying, only to be met by Michelle Carter's insistence that he follow through. They highlighted her messages urging him forward, her framing of death as relief, and most critically her admission that she told him to get back into the truck after he had stepped out. To them, this was the decisive act. At the precise point where Conrad's instinct to live had resurfaced, Michelle intervened and directed him back toward lethal conditions, transforming hesitation into completion. The defense, by contrast, argued that Conrad's depression and prior suicide attempts showed an independent trajectory toward death, that Michelle's words, however troubling, did not override his autonomy, and that criminalizing speech in such circumstances risked punishing emotional exchanges rather than actions. They emphasized that Conrad alone started the generator, sealed the cab, and remained inside, asserting that responsibility for those choices could not legally transfer to another person who was not present. The courtroom tension reflected more than disagreement over facts. It exposed a deeper conflict about how far influence can extend before it becomes culpability. When the verdict was delivered, the judge found Michelle Carter guilty of involuntary manslaughter, concluding that her conduct went beyond passive communication into wanton and reckless behavior that directly contributed to Conrad Henry Roy III's death. The ruling centered on the moment she instructed him to return to the truck after he had escaped, determining that this intervention at a point of imminent rescue created legal responsibility despite her physical absence. The decision marked a legal precedent in which spoken and written encouragement, delivered remotely, was deemed capable of causing fatal harm when directed at a vulnerable individual in crisis. For Conrad's family, the judgment offered recognition that his death had not been his burden alone, while for Michelle Carter it transformed the messages she sent in private into evidence of criminal liability. The broader impact extended beyond both, establishing that in the United States a person's words, when used to push another towards self-destruction, could meet the threshold of manslaughter. For the first time in American history, the law held that influence carried through communication alone could be judged capable of killing. The case of Conrad Henry Roy III and Michelle Carter left behind more than a verdict and a sentence. It left a country unsettled by what it revealed about connection in the modern world. Their relationship unfolded almost entirely through devices carried in pockets and held in hands. Yet within that invisible space, emotions intensified, dependence formed, and influence traveled without the limits of distance or presence. For generations, relationships were shaped by shared environments and immediate accountability, but Conrad and Michelle inhabited a bond sustained through constant messaging, where affirmation and pressure could be delivered at any hour and absorbed in isolation. The court's conclusion that Michelle's words contributed directly to Conrad's death forced recognition that communication itself can alter action, that persuasion directed at someone already fragile may carry consequences once thought impossible without physical force. The tragedy exposed how easily vulnerability can be amplified when one person becomes the sole interpreter of another's suffering, and how encouragement framed as understanding can shift perception until escape appears to lie only in ending life. This case forced a nation to confront a terrifying question. In an age where relationships exist through screens, where influence travels instantly, and where vulnerability can be manipulated from miles away, how much power do our words truly hold? The messages Michelle Carter sent to Conrad Henry Roy III were not abstract statements cast into the void. They reached a specific person at a specific moment of fear and hesitation, and the law determined that their impact was inseparable from the outcome that followed. Yet even within that judgment, discomfort remains, because Conrad's depression was real, his suffering profound, and his actions his own in the physical sense, leaving an uneasy space between autonomy and coercion that no verdict can fully resolve. If someone pushes another toward death through insistence and emotional leverage, where should responsibility begin and where should it end? And how should society weigh the boundary between influence and choice? Do you believe Michelle Carter caused Conrad Roy's death? Or was this a tragedy no one could stop? If this story moved you, share your perspective below, because conversations like this shape how we understand responsibility, influence, and care in the digital age. And if you want more true stories that explore the real human consequences behind headlines, consider to like and subscribe. Join us for the next case.